Picture the South Pacific in the dead of night. August 1943. Lackett Strait, somewhere between New Georgia and Kolombangara. The darkness is absolute, the water black and warm. Then, out of the silence, a sound like God clearing his throat. 3 Packard engines thundering to life. 4,050 combined horsepower hammering against a 78-foot mahogany hull. The vessel barely seems to touch the water. It flies across it. 40 knots in the darkness. No lights, no radio silence. Torpedo tubes armed and angled forward. 4 young men in Navy dungarees, gripping whatever they can find as the jungle. Shoreline blurs past 30 feet to Port Dodd. This was the PT boat in its element. Fast, lethal, disposable. In the best possible sense, cheap enough to risk, quick enough to survive. They called them the Plywood Navy and meant it as an insult, but the crews who drove them took a different view. These boats had carried General Douglas MacArthur out of Corregidor in February 1942 when the Philippines fell, racing through Japanese-controlled waters at full throttle with the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Pacific crouched in the aft cockpit. A young lieutenant named John Fitzgerald Kennedy commanded PT 109 in these same waters until a Japanese destroyer cut it in half in the dark and turned his crew's survival into a legend that followed him all the way to the White House dot by the spring of 1945. The United States Navy operated 531 of these vessels. They patrolled from the Philippines to Okinawa, from the English Channel to the Mediterranean. They harassed Japanese supply convoys, delivered US agents onto enemy-held shores, and sank destroyers many times their size. They were the fastest, most audacious combat vessels the American arsenal possessed. And then the war ended. And everything that made them extraordinary became the very reason they had to disappear. To understand what happened next, one has to understand what a PT boat actually was and what it was not. The program began in 1940, when the Navy, watching the war in Europe accelerate, needed a fast attack craft capable of operating in the shallow, island-choked waters of the Pacific. 2 manufacturers answered the call. Elko Naval Division in Bayonne, New Jersey, produced an 80-foot design. Higgins Industries in New Orleans produced a 78-foot rival. The 2 companies argued about hull form, engine placement, and seakeeping characteristics for the duration of the war. But both converged on the same mechanical solution: 3 Packard 4M2500 marine gasoline engines, each developing 1,350 horsepower, turning 3 propeller shafts and pushing a lightweight plywood and mahogany hull to speeds that made contemporary destroyers look stationary by comparison. In combat configuration, a PT boat carried 4 torpedo tubes, twin .50 caliber machine gun turrets, a 20mm cannon, and a crew of 12 to 14 men. It displaced roughly 56 tons fully loaded, wider than a single-gun turret on a battleship. It could accelerate to full speed in seconds and turn inside the wake of vessels 3 times its length. Against a Japanese supply convoy running through the darkness of a Pacific strait, it was precisely the right weapon between 1940 and 1945. American shipyards delivered 531 of these boats to the Navy, plus dozens more to Allied nations under Lend-Lease. At the program's absolute peak in late 1944, PT squadrons operated across 7 distinct theaters simultaneously. The investment in men, machinery, and manufacturing capacity was enormous. The boats were not cheap to build. Each one cost roughly $600,000 and $1,945, a figure equivalent to several million today. Training their crews, maintaining their temperamental Packard engines, and supplying their bases across the Pacific required a logistics chain of considerable complexity. All of that was purpose-built for one specific war, against one specific enemy, in one specific kind of terrain. And on the 2nd of September 1945, that war ended. The Navy's problem was not merely logistical. It was philosophical. A PT boat is a weapon of ambush. It works in shallow water, at night, against a surface fleet unprepared for its speed. By the autumn of 1945, the surface fleet it had been built to fight no longer existed. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been effectively destroyed at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. What remained of it by August 1945 was mostly wreckage on the floors of Pacific atolls. The mission that justified 531 PT boats had ceased to exist before the surrender ceremony on the deck of USS Missouri. The broader calculus of post-war naval power made the situation worse. The Navy in 1945 was not thinking about fast attack craft in shallow tropical waters. It was thinking about battleships, aircraft carriers, nuclear weapons, and a coming Cold War against the Soviet Union, an adversary whose navy was primarily a submarine force operating in deep water across the North Atlantic. In that strategic environment, a 78-foot plywood speedboat with torpedo tubes contributed approximately nothing. Congress was already demanding rapid demobilization. The American public wanted its sons home and its war economy converted back to consumer production. Defense budgets were contracting by the week. The Navy faced brutal choices about which capabilities to preserve and which to abandon, and the mathematics were unambiguous. Maintaining hundreds of specialized small combatants, with their hungry engines and demanding hulls, against no foreseeable operational requirement made no fiscal sense whatsoever. A survey conducted by the Navy in September and October 1945 reached conclusions that surprised no one who had been paying attention. Of the 531 PT boats built, approximately 69 had been lost during combat operations, sunk by enemy fire, run aground in unfamiliar waters, scuttled to prevent capture. 14 more had been lost to accidents and weather. That left roughly 448 hulls scattered across bases in the Philippines, Dutch New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Italy, England, and France. The survey team's assessment was direct. Most of these hulls were not simply surplus. They were exhausted. Years of hard service in tropical waters had done to them what such service always does to wooden vessels. Marine borers had riddled the plywood below the waterline. The mahogany planking had checked and split in equatorial heat. The Packard engines, brilliant machines, but demanding ones, had run to the limit of their service intervals and beyond. The bronze fittings had corroded. The electrical systems had been jury-rigged so many times that the original wiring diagrams were irrelevant. Restoration to full operational condition would cost, in many cases, more than the boats had cost to build originally. And there was nowhere to operate them and nothing for them to do. The decision followed as inevitably as arithmetic. What happened to America's PT boats in the 18 months following the Japanese surrender was swift, efficient, and by any standard of historical sentiment, almost violent in its thoroughness. The Navy's Foreign Liquidation Commission, working in parallel with the War Assets Administration, took responsibility for the disposal. The methodology they settled on was not complicated. Burning wooden vessels sounds destructive, but it was, by the standards of 1945 naval practice, a recognized and legitimate disposal procedure. It solved several problems simultaneously. A burned hull could not become a navigation hazard. It could not be salvaged and repurposed by unauthorized parties. And it reduced the boat to its recoverable metal components, the bronze propellers, the aluminum fittings, the stainless hardware that post-war reconstruction efforts across Asia and Europe needed. At Samar in the Philippines, The scenes that unfolded in late 1945 and into 1946 were ones that veterans who witnessed them remembered for decades. Dozens of PT boats were hauled onto beaches and arranged in rows. The Packard engines, still functional in some cases, worth recovering for separate sale, were pulled from the engine compartments and set aside. Then the boats were set alight. Mahogany burns well. Varnished mahogany, the kind applied in generous coats to PT boat hulls, burns with particular ferocity. Witnesses described columns of black and orange flame, visible for miles along the Samar coastline, as boats that had once raced through Blackett Strait and Vela Gulf were reduced, in a matter of hours, to ash and twisted bronze. The boats that had outrun Japanese destroyers could not outrun the decisions of their own government. Similar scenes occurred at Mioswandi in Dutch New Guinea, at Green Island in the Solomons, at other Pacific bases whose names had briefly meant something during the war and would be forgotten within a generation. The pace of disposal was not leisurely. The Foreign Liquidation Commission had neither the budget nor the mandate to warehouse hundreds of deteriorating wooden hulls indefinitely. The work proceeded quickly, methodically, and with a thoroughness that left almost nothing behind.